Harold Vance didn't knock. That was the first thing Eliza Whitmore noticed when the door to her cabin swung open on that gray February morning. The bank owner didn't knock, didn't wait, didn't even pause on the step. He simply walked in the way men like him always walked into spaces they'd already decided belonged to them. Two men came in behind him, both wearing the flat, practiced expressions of people paid not to feel anything. Maisie was still at the table, a half-eaten bowl of porridge going cold in front of her. She was 6 years old, and she looked up at the strangers the way small children look at things they don't yet have words for. Not frightened, just waiting to understand. Mrs. Whitmore. Vance didn't remove his hat. Your 30 days are up. Eliza stood between him and her daughter without making the decision to do it. Her feet just moved. I have work coming in, she said. I told you that. I have 3 orders promised by the end of the month. You told me that in December. He looked around the cabin the way an auctioneer looks at inventory. You told me something similar in November. She had. That was the part that made her jaw tighten. She had told him exactly that, and both times she had believed it, and both times the orders had either fallen through or paid less than promised. And here she was again, standing in her own home, feeling like a trespasser. The machine stays, she said. You're not taking the machine. He looked at the sewing machine in the corner. Her husband Daniel's last gift to her, purchased the spring before he died, carried on the back of a wagon for 200 miles. Vance looked at it the way he looked at everything in the room, like a number. I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, Mrs. Whitmore. If you had everything taken from you, your husband, your security, you're standing in a town that only respected people who didn't need anything, and then a man walked into your home without knocking and looked at the one tool keeping you and your child alive like it was already gone. What would you do? What would you do? This is the story of Eliza Whitmore, a woman this town had already written off, and the long, hard, unglamorous road she walked to prove every single one of them wrong. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with us before, you already know we don't do easy stories on this channel. We do true ones. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. And while you're at it, drop a like and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that cabin and to the morning Eliza Whitmore decided she was done asking for mercy. The winter of 1887 had been the kind that didn't announce itself with drama. It came in slowly, degree by degree, until one morning you woke up and the water in the pitcher by the bed had frozen solid overnight, and you understood, with a flatness in your chest that had nothing to do with surprise, that the cold was going to be a problem for a long time. Eliza had grown up in Ohio, in a house with a proper stove, and a father who kept the woodpile stacked before the first frost. She had not grown up for Montana. She was not sure anyone truly grew up for Montana. You either learned it the hard way or you didn't last. She had been learning it the hard way for 4 years, and she was 31 years old, and some mornings she woke up feeling twice that. Daniel had brought her here. She didn't blame him for it, had stopped blaming him for most things somewhere in the long, quiet months after his death. But the fact remained. This had been his idea. He had a cousin with land, he said. He had read things, heard things, believed with the sincere, uncomplicated confidence of a man who had never yet been badly wrong that Montana was where a man could build something that lasted. He had been right about the building. He had not accounted for the dying. The accident happened on a Tuesday in late October, 2 years ago now. A section of fence line on the Callaway Ranch where Daniel had been hired for seasonal work. A horse spooked by something no one could afterward identify. A post that should have been set deeper. The details came to her secondhand, pieced together from what other men said with their hats in their hands and their eyes on the ground, and she had stopped asking for more details at some point because more details did not change what the details added up to. She was a widow at 29. Maisie had just turned 4. The town of Harlan's Creek was not a cruel place exactly. It was a practical place, which sometimes amounted to the same thing. People had brought food in those first weeks, had checked on her, had said the things people say with varying degrees of sincerity. But Harlan's Creek was a town that understood the world in terms of what things could produce and what they cost. And a widow with a small child and no male relative within 500 miles was, in the ledger of a frontier town's collective mind, a liability. The offers came in that first year. Most of them were not the kind of offers a woman with any options would have considered. A rancher named Prewitt, who was already married, suggested an arrangement he didn't bother to dignify with a name. A much older widower proposed marriage in the same tone he might have used to discuss a land trade. Practical, dispassionate, already decided. A woman who ran the boarding house offered to take Maisie in for the time being, phrasing it as generosity, while Eliza understood perfectly well what it meant. She declined all of them. She declined them the way you close a door in winter, firmly, because you cannot afford to leave it open. What she had was the sewing machine and what she knew how to do with it. Her mother had taught her to sew the way some mothers teach their daughters to read, early, seriously, as though it were a language that would serve her all her life. And it had. She was fast, she was careful, and she could do things with a needle and thread that took other women twice as long and came out half as good. She had always known this without vanity, the same way she knew her own height or the color of her hair, simply as a fact about herself. The problem was that Harlan's Creek did not much value what she could do. The wives of the wealthier families had dresses made by a woman who came up from Billings twice a year. The working ranch families mended their own clothes or let things go until they fell apart. The few orders Eliza had managed to secure in those first months had been fitful and underpaid. A set of curtains for the hotel, some alterations for the school teacher, a quilt commissioned by a woman who then moved away before she paid for it. She had gone to the bank in November of the first year, when the debt on the cabin was already 2 months behind. Harold Vance had listened to her with the particular brand of patience that isn't patience at all, the kind that's really just a man waiting for a woman to finish talking so he can say what he'd already decided before she started. He gave her 30 days. Then another 30. Then he started charging interest on the interest, which was, she had later been told by the town's only attorney, legally questionable but practically impossible to fight, without money she did not have. She had knocked on doors that autumn. Ranches, the general store, the hotel, the saloon. She was not proud, and she was not ashamed either. Pride and shame are luxuries, and she had stripped her life down to necessities. She could sew, she could cook, she could keep books, she could manage a household with the ruthless efficiency of someone who knew what happened when you didn't. She told all of this to whoever would listen. Most of them were kind enough about it, kind in the way that costs nothing. It was on the afternoon of December 14th. She remembered the date because Maisie had woken that morning with a fever, and Eliza had spent the night before praying at the foot of the child's bed with the specific, unsentimental focus of someone who has no room for emotion to get in the way of necessity. It was on that afternoon that she walked into the Copper Rail Saloon, which she had avoided until then because it was not the kind of place a decent woman entered, and she had spent 2 years carefully maintaining the reputation of a decent woman because it was one of the few resources she had left. She went in because she had heard that the owner was looking for someone to make new seat cushions for his card tables, and because she had exactly 11 cents in her coat pocket and the fever had broken, but the medicine had cost her the last of the money she'd set aside, and she had calculated, walking across the frozen street, that she could not get through the next 2 weeks without some income, and the cushion order was the only lead she had. The saloon was dim and smelled of tobacco and sawdust and something sour she preferred not to identify. 4 men were at a table near the window. 2 more leaned against the bar. The bartender, a thick-necked man named Rudy, who she'd seen at church and who had always nodded to her politely, looked genuinely startled to see her standing there. Maisie was pressed against her side, small fingers wrapped around 2 of Eliza's. She had not meant to bring the child. She had left her at Mrs. Pollard's next door, but Maisie had followed her out without her noticing, and by the time she realized it, they were already halfway across the street, and turning back would have cost her the nerve she'd spent the whole morning building up. "I'm looking for Mr. Denny," she said to Rudy, because looking at the men at the table made her feel the way she imagined a person felt standing at the edge of a cliff, and she needed to look at something that didn't require her to justify her presence. "I heard he has work." Rudy opened his mouth, and before he could answer, one of the men at the table laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, just the laugh of a man who found something amusing without caring whether the subject of his amusement found it so. "Denny's in Billings," the man said. "Won't be back till the new year." She absorbed that, put it somewhere small and tight in her chest, and kept her face exactly where it was. "Thank you," she said. She should have left. She knew she should have left. But Maisie had spotted a plate on the table nearest the window. One of the men had pushed back from a meal he'd left unfinished, a piece of bread still sitting on the edge of the plate. and the child was staring at it with the frank, uncomplicated honesty that only small children and very hungry people can manage. Eliza felt the stare before she saw it, not from the man whose food it was, from the far end of the table. A man she didn't recognize. He was maybe 40, with the broad-shouldered, weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors, and he was watching her daughter with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity, not amusement, something more careful than either. He stood up, which surprised her, because men in saloons rarely stood up for women who came in through the wrong door. And he said, in a voice that was quieter than she expected, "You want to sit down, ma'am? It's cold out, and this table's got room." She almost said no. The word was actually forming itself when Maisie looked up at her with those eyes that were still a little glassy from the fever, and Eliza heard herself say, instead, "For a minute, thank you." His name was Colton Reeves. She learned that when he introduced himself, which he did without fanfare, extending a hand across the table as though she were a business associate he was meeting for the first time. He had a ranch, he said, 12 miles east of town. He had come in for supplies and a meal and was planning to head back before the weather turned again. He ordered Maisie a bowl of soup. He did it quietly, just nodded to Rudy, and she almost objected, and then she looked at her daughter's hands, which were still cold, and she didn't. "You're Mrs. Whitmore," he said. It wasn't a question. "You know me?" "I know of you." He set his coffee down. "You made the curtains for the hotel last fall. Henderson told me. He said you were fast and your seams were straight." She had no idea what to do with this information. "That's accurate," she said. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. "Henderson's not a man who gives compliments. He says you asked him for more work, and he didn't have it. I asked several people." "I know." He looked at her in the same careful way he'd looked at Maisie, like he was trying to understand something, not make a judgment about it. "I have 40 men on my payroll. They work hard and they're rough on their clothes. I spend more on replacement wool shirts than I'd like, and the woman who used to do mending for the bunkhouse moved to Denver in September." Eliza held very still. "I'm not offering charity," he said, before she could speak. "I've got work, real work, regular work, and I pay what it's worth." The soup arrived. Maisie wrapped both hands around the bowl and began eating with the focused seriousness of a child who has learned not to take food for granted, and Eliza watched her and felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a name for. Something between relief and grief, and something else she couldn't put words to. Something that had to do with the fact that help, when it finally came, sometimes arrived from directions you hadn't thought to look. She looked at Colton Reeves and said, "Tell me what you need." He told her. It was not a small list. Repairs on working clothes, shirts, trousers, heavy canvas coats that took hard use in all weather. Wool blankets for the bunkhouse that needed the edges bound properly or they unraveled within a season. Some custom-cut saddlebags he'd been putting off because the man in town who made them did shoddy work. He spoke about these things the way he seemed to speak about everything, plainly, without decoration, as though language were a tool, and he didn't see any reason to use more of it than the job required. She asked questions. How many men, how frequently, what the turnaround expectation was. She was already calculating in her head, fabric costs, time, what she could complete in a week if Maisie slept through the nights, what she could bill without undercutting herself to the point of making the work pointless. When she named her rate, he didn't flinch or negotiate. He nodded. "That's fair," he said. She did not realize until she was back outside in the cold, Maisie's hand in hers, that her chest had unclenched somewhere during that conversation for the first time, and she could not remember how long. She stopped on the wooden walkway and stood there for a moment just breathing, while Maisie looked up at her and asked if they could get soup again sometime. "Yes," Eliza said. "We can get soup again." She meant it. For the first time in months, she meant something like it. The first delivery arrived at her cabin the following Monday. 2 of Colton's men brought it on a wagon. A crate of worn shirts, 2 canvas coats with split seams, and a note written in Colton's plain, economical hand that listed each item, the nature of the repair needed, and a timeline she found almost laughably generous. He had given her 3 weeks for work she could complete in 10 days. She worked nights. She worked mornings before Maisie woke up. She worked with the wood stove burning low to save fuel and a lamp angled just so over the machine, and the rhythm of it, needle and thread, the hum of the mechanism, The particular satisfaction of pulling a straight seam through a damaged piece of cloth and making it whole again settled something in her that the months of fear and scrambling had unsettled. She was not happy. She was not unhappy. She was working, and for now that was sufficient. The shirts came back neatly folded in the same crate, with a letter on top itemizing each piece and confirming the rate she'd named. At the bottom, in different handwriting than the main body, someone had written the body for him, she realized. His own writing was functional, but clearly not fast. There was a single additional line in Colton's hand. Good work. More coming next week. She set the letter on the table and read that line 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in the tin box where she kept important documents, alongside Maisie's birth papers and the deed to the cabin and Daniel's death certificate, and she went back to the machine. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were different from the weeks before them. Different in kind, not just degree. She had money coming in, not enough to pay the full debt she owed Vance, but enough to chip at it, enough to buy proper food and keep the stove fed, and put a small amount aside in the tin box alongside the letter. She had a rhythm. She had a reason to get up at 5 o'clock when the cold made staying in bed feel like the only reasonable option. She was still invisible in Harlan's Creek. The women she'd known in the first years, the wives of the ranchers and tradesmen, had not unkindly but quite clearly organized their social circles in ways that didn't include a widow who was struggling to make rent. Invitations she'd once received had stopped arriving. She didn't blame them. Social networks in a frontier town were tied to stability and standing, and she had neither. But the loneliness was real, and she didn't pretend otherwise, even to herself. She had Maisie, who was bright and asked complicated questions and was learning to read from a primer Eliza had ordered from back east, paying for it in small installments. She had the work. She had the small, precise pleasure of doing something well. She did not have quite enough of anything. In January, Vance sent a letter reminding her that the restructured payment he'd agreed to in November was due by the end of February, and that any further delay would result in proceedings he'd been patient enough to defer, but could not continue to defer indefinitely. The phrasing was polished, almost courteous, and it made her furious in a way that raw threats might not have. There was something particularly exhausting about cruelty that dressed itself up as reasonableness. She went to see Colton on a Wednesday, which she did not do lightly. The ranch was 12 miles and she had no horse. She borrowed a neighbor's mule, which took some doing, and the road was ice-packed and the sky the particular flat white that meant more snow before nightfall. She arrived with numb fingers and made herself wait until the feeling came back before she knocked on the ranch office door, because she did not want to appear as desperate as she was. He opened the door himself. He looked briefly surprised to see her, then stepped back to let her in. She explained the situation in full. Not asking for anything, she told herself, just explaining. A businesswoman discussing a cash flow problem with a client who was already familiar with her work. She laid it out plainly. What she owed, what she was earning, what the gap was, what Vance intended if the gap wasn't closed. Colton listened without interrupting. He did not look sympathetic, which was one of the things she had already come to appreciate about him. He did not perform feelings he didn't have. When she finished, he said, "How much are you short?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I've got 3 other ranchers who've been asking me about reliable sewing work. Henderson's been talking about you. I can put you in front of them this week if you're willing." She hadn't expected that. She'd expected either an offer to loan her the money, which she was prepared to refuse on principle, or some version of sympathy she'd have no use for. Not this. Not a business solution to a business problem. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." He set up the meetings himself. He did not go with her to them. She understood, without it needing to be said, that him accompanying her would undermine exactly what she was trying to establish. But he made the introductions, put his name behind hers as a reference, and made clear to each of the men that he was recommending her work, not soliciting charity on her behalf. She went to 3 ranch meetings in 2 weeks. She brought samples, repaired shirts, a wool blanket she'd bound so tightly the edges hadn't moved in a month of use, a saddlebag she'd made from scratch from a pattern she'd developed herself. She answered questions straightforwardly. She named her rates without apology. She came home from the 3rd meeting with 2 new contracts in her hand and sat down at the kitchen table and cried for about 4 minutes, which she felt she had earned, and then she washed her face and went back to work. February arrived cold and unambiguous. She had more orders than she'd had at any point since Daniel died. She had paying work on the machine every single day. She was still short. The math was close, but not close enough, and she knew it. And the end of the month was approaching with the particular indifference of a calendar that doesn't care about anyone's problems. She was in the middle of a coat repair on the morning of February 14th when she heard boots on the step. Not a knock she recognized. Too heavy, too certain, too much like something that had already made up its mind. She opened the door before the knock finished. Harold Vance stood on her step in his good coat with his two men behind him, and his face had the flat, settled expression of a man who had come to do something unpleasant and had already arranged not to feel bad about it. Maisie was at the table. The porridge. The look on her daughter's face, not frightened, just waiting to understand. Eliza stepped into the doorframe. Not a dramatic gesture, just the only place her body knew to go. "Your 30 days are up," Vance said. She did not say she knew. She did not say anything for a moment because she was doing arithmetic, brutal, rapid arithmetic, calculating what she had in the tin box and what was owed on the remaining contracts, and whether she could close the gap by the end of the week, and the arithmetic kept coming up short by an amount that was not large in absolute terms, but was, given where she stood, insurmountable. "I have work in," she said. 3 contracts. Payment due by end of month." "We're at end of month, Mrs. Whitmore." "End of February is the 28th. Today is the 14th. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt. She wasn't naive enough to call it that. Irritation, maybe, at being corrected. "The agreement specified end of month, which I have been generous enough to interpret as today. It's the 14th, she said again. Flat. Not asking, stating. He held her gaze. She held his. Behind her, she heard Maisie set down her spoon. "I'll be back on the 28th, Vance said in a tone that made clear he was doing her an enormous favor. "If the balance is not settled by then, I will have no choice but to proceed." He looked past her at the machine. "In full." He left. His men left with him. The door closed and the cabin was quiet, except for the stove and Maisie's breathing and the distant sound of the wind picking up outside. Eliza stood at the closed door for a moment. "Mama," Maisie said. "I know, sweetheart." She turned around. "Finish your breakfast. It's getting cold." She crossed the room and sat back down at the machine, because the coat wasn't going to finish itself, and she had 13 days to close a gap that was almost but not quite impossible. And she had learned in the last 2 years that almost was the word you worked with. Almost meant there was still room. She picked up the needle. Outside, the snow had started again. Not a storm, just the steady, patient accumulation of a Montana winter that doesn't explain itself or apologize, that simply continues until it doesn't. And inside the cabin, in the small circle of lamplight over the machine, Eliza Whitmore bent her head and kept working, and the needle moved and the seam held. It always held. That was the one thing she could count on. The seam always held if you said it right. The 28th came in on a Thursday, which felt appropriate somehow. Not a Monday with its pretense of fresh starts, not a Friday with its suggestion of relief ahead, just a Thursday, gray and indifferent, the kind of day that didn't promise anything in either direction. Eliza had been up since 4. She hadn't slept well in the 3 days leading up to it, which she accepted without drama. Sleep was a negotiation with the mind, and her mind had not been in a cooperative mood. She lay in the dark each night running the numbers she already knew, adjusting for possibilities she'd already accounted for, arriving each time at the same answer, which was that she was short by $19.40, and that Vance would be at her door by mid-morning, and that the sewing machine, Daniel's machine, the thing that was keeping her and Maisie in food and firewood and the thin margin between managing and drowning, would be gone by noon if she didn't find a way to close that gap in the next few hours. She had already tried. That was the part that sat in her chest like a stone. She had not been idle, and she had not been careless, and she had worked every hour that the lamp would hold and Maisie would sleep, and she was still $19.40 short, and there was no version of the arithmetic she hadn't already run. She made Maisie's breakfast before the child woke up. Oatmeal with a little brown sugar she'd been rationing since January, and she put extra sugar in it that morning without consciously deciding to, some instinct she didn't examine too closely. She was standing at the stove when Maisie came out of the bedroom in her nightgown, hair tangled, dragging the small quilt she'd claimed as her own since she was 2 years old. "Is today the bad day?" Maisie asked. Eliza turned to look at her daughter. 6 years old, and already she understood bad days as a category. That hit somewhere it shouldn't have, but Eliza kept her face even. "It's just a Thursday," she said. "Come eat." Maisie climbed into her chair and ate without asking more questions, which was itself unusual enough that Eliza noticed it. The child was watching her over the rim of the bowl. Not anxious exactly, but attentive in the way children get when they've absorbed more from adult behavior than the adults intended to communicate. Eliza drank her coffee and watched the light come up through the window and waited. The knock came at 9:30. It was a different knock than the one 14 days ago. Slower, more deliberate, the knock of a man who wasn't in a hurry because he knew how this was going to end. She opened the door. Vance was there, same coat, same two men. But this time there was a fourth person, a younger man she didn't recognize, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the careful, neutral expression of someone who'd been hired to document things rather than feel them. A clerk, she understood. He'd brought a clerk. He'd brought paperwork. "Mrs. Whitmore." He nodded, not unkindly. He genuinely didn't appear to take pleasure in this, and she found that somehow worse than if he had. Pleasure would have given her something to push against. This was just business, and business didn't care what it cost her. "I trust you've had time to consider your position." "I have the contracts," she said. She had them in her hand. 3 folded documents, signed by 3 separate ranch owners, each specifying payment amounts and delivery dates, all of them within the next 2 weeks. She held them out. 3 contracts, all signed, all in progress. Total value exceeds what I owe you by $14. He took the papers. He read them without hurrying. The clerk watched. The 2 men behind Vance looked at nothing in particular. "These are promises of payment," Vance said, handing them back. "Not payment. They're contracts. Legal, signed contracts. From men who could change their minds, fall on hard times, or simply decide the work isn't satisfactory." He said it almost gently. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have a board to answer to. I cannot carry your account on the basis of promissory arrangements. You carried it for 3 months. At considerable patience and at cost to myself, yes." He looked past her again. That same look she recognized, the inventory look. "I need what's owed, or I need to begin recovery of the collateral." She had known this was coming. She had known it since 4 in the morning and probably before that, probably since the 14th when she'd watched him walk away and started doing the math, and kept arriving at the same number. She had known, and she had prepared herself for it, or she had believed she had, and standing here now she understood that you cannot actually prepare yourself for the moment your last option closes. You can know it's coming. That isn't the same. She heard Maisie get down from the chair inside. "Mama?" She turned slightly, keeping herself in the doorframe. "Stay inside, sweetheart." "Mama, there's a man at the fence." She turned further, despite herself, and looked. There was a man at the fence, and then she recognized who it was, and her stomach did something complicated she didn't have a name for. Colton Reeves tied his horse at the post with the particular unhurried efficiency of a man who had done the calculation before he arrived and knew exactly what he intended to do. He wore his working coat, not his good one, which for some reason she noticed. He had ridden 12 miles and he hadn't dressed up for it. He walked toward the cabin without looking at Vance, or at the clerk, or at the 2 men flanking the door. He looked at Eliza. She shook her head. It was small, barely a movement, and she didn't know exactly what she was communicating with it. "Don't," or "not like this," or "I didn't ask you to come." But he saw it. She was certain he saw it, and he stopped a few feet from the step. "Mr. Vance," he said. His voice was the same as it always was, even, not performing anything. Vance turned. His expression shifted into something more cautious. Colton Reeves was not a man whose ill will you wanted, and Vance was not a fool. "Mr. Reeves." He nodded. "This is a private financial matter." "I know what it is." Colton was still looking at Eliza, not at Vance. "I've got ranch business to discuss with Mrs. Whitmore. When you're done." Vance looked between them. The clerk shifted his satchel. One of the 2 men coughed. "We'll be a few minutes yet," Vance said carefully. "I'll wait." He said it without threat, without drama, without any of the things a man might deploy to make himself felt in a situation like this. He just said it, and then he stood there, and somehow the simple fact of him standing there changed the weight of everything. Vance turned back to Eliza, and she saw, in the careful way he was now choosing his words, That Colton's presence had shifted something, not resolved anything, not solved the fundamental problem of $19.40, but shifted the dynamic in some way she was still working out. "Perhaps we might discuss a brief extension," Vance said. "Given the contracts in hand, you just told me contracts weren't sufficient," she said. He had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. "A short extension, 1 week. If payment in full is received by next Thursday, we can consider this matter resolved without further action." She looked at him for a long moment. 1 week. She had 2 of the 3 contracts paying out in that window. The third was 10 days out, but she could perhaps negotiate early payment. She'd done it before, though she disliked asking. 1 week, she said, in writing. He blinked. Then he turned to the clerk and said something quiet, and the clerk opened the satchel and produced a single sheet, and Vance wrote on it and signed it and handed it to her. And she read every word before she took it, which made the clerk look at his feet and Vance look at the middle distance, and then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "Next Thursday," she said. He nodded and turned, and he and his men and his clerk walked back toward the street, and she watched them go. She was still watching when she heard Colton come up behind her onto the step. Not beside her. A step behind, leaving her at the front of her own doorway, and she recognized that for what it was, deliberate, considered, and some of the tightness in her shoulders eased a fraction. "You didn't need to come," she said. "No," he agreed. "How did you know?" "Frank Dillard mentioned the bank had been seen at your place. He mentioned it to his wife. She mentioned it to my housekeeper when she was in town." He paused. "It travels." She supposed it did. In a town this size, everything did. "I'm not taking money from you," she said. She turned to look at him because she wanted to say this to his face and not to the street. "I want to be clear about that. I have a week, and I have 2 contracts, and I believe I can close the gap. But I'm not taking money." He looked back at her with that expression she still hadn't entirely decoded. Not the calculating look of a man deciding whether a proposition was worth his time. Not the careful blankness of a man trying not to reveal what he thought. Something more direct than either, like he was simply registering what she said and taking it seriously. "I didn't bring money," he said. She waited. "I brought a list." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. 7 ranchers in the valley. I've spoken to all of them this week. They all have work. Clothes, blankets, equipment repairs. Some of them have been getting by without because they don't have someone reliable. He held the list out. "They're expecting you." She took the paper and unfolded it. 7 names, 7 properties, notes beside each one about what they needed. His handwriting, that functional, undecorated script she'd come to recognize, was compressed, efficient, fitting more information into the space than most people would have managed. She looked at the numbers beside each name. If even 4 of them came through in the next week. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket beside the extension agreement. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not ungratefully, genuinely wanting to know. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who didn't have an answer, but of someone deciding how much of it to give. "My mother took in washing," he said, "after my father went. We were in Kansas then. I was maybe 8 or 9. She did laundry for half the town, and she was good at it, and she kept us fed doing it, me and my 2 sisters, for 4 years until I was old enough to hire out." He looked at the street, then back at her. Nobody helped her, not for lack of people who could have. They just didn't think to. He paused. "I think about that more than I probably should." Eliza held the paper in her pocket without saying anything. "You've got good work," he said, and his tone had returned to its usual matter-of-fact register, as if he'd said more than he'd intended and was pulling back to familiar ground. "People need to know it exists. That's all this is." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." "Colton," he said, "we've been doing business long enough." She almost smiled, which surprised her. "Colton." He nodded and went back to his horse, and she watched him ride out, and then she went inside and spread the list on the table beside Maisie's primer, and started planning which properties she could reach first, and how much she could reasonably promise in a week. She visited the first name on the list that afternoon. A man named Hargrove, whose ranch was 4 miles north, reachable on the borrowed mule if she left early enough. She brought samples again. She always brought samples now, had learned early that people needed to see the work, not hear about it. and she was shown into Hargrove's front room by a woman she assumed was his wife, who looked at the samples with open interest before Eliza had even set them down properly. "These seams," the woman said, turning a shirt over in her hands. "Who taught you that technique?" "My mother," Eliza said. "She worked as a seamstress in Cincinnati before she married." Cincinnati. The woman, Martha, she introduced herself, with the directness of a woman who'd been managing things too long to bother with formality, held the shirt up to the window light. "You don't see work like this out here. The man in town, Patterson, he does passable work on simple repairs, but anything complicated he botches." "I don't botch complicated work," Eliza said. It came out more plainly than she'd intended. Not boastful, just a statement of fact. And she tensed slightly, wondering if it had landed wrong. Martha laughed. It was a short, genuine sound. "I believe you." She set the shirt down. "Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore. Tell me what you charge." She left Hargrove's ranch with a contract and something she hadn't expected. An invitation to return the following week for dinner, extended by Martha as she walked Eliza to the door, in the offhand way of a woman whose social life was limited by distance and who had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she'd enjoyed the conversation. Eliza rode back on the mule in the darkening afternoon, and she thought about Martha Hargrove and her direct laugh and the way she'd held the shirt up to the light, and it occurred to her that she had been so focused on the survival dimension of the last 2 years that she had lost track of the other dimensions, that she had allowed herself to become the struggling widow of Harlan's Creek so completely that she had stopped being other things. A woman who could talk about technique and craft and Cincinnati, a woman worth having to dinner, a woman who might be interesting to someone besides Maisie and whatever version of her a 6-year-old perceived. It was a small thought. She filed it away and kept writing. The second and third names on the list she visited the next day, combining both into a single trip since their properties were adjacent. These ranchers were men without wives on the premises. Both had the slightly chaotic domestic arrangements of bachelors who'd convinced themselves they were managing fine. And they looked at her samples with the earnest attention of people who had been living with things coming apart at the seams, literally, for longer than they wanted to admit. The second man, a lanky redhead named Cobb, who couldn't have been older than 25, showed her a coat with a split up the back that was so extensive she nearly asked how he'd been wearing it at all. He looked slightly embarrassed about it. "I kept meaning to deal with it," he said. "How long has it been like this?" He squinted. "Maybe since last spring?" She repaired it on the spot, there at his kitchen table, because she'd brought her travel kit, and because it would take 40 minutes, and because she wanted him to see what the work actually looked like in progress. He watched her from across the table with an expression somewhere between fascination and relief. And when she was done and handed it back, he put it on immediately, which made her feel something she recognized from the early years of her marriage, the satisfaction of having done something useful for someone who actually needed it. He paid her then and there, which almost no one did, and she noted this about him as the kind of person worth remembering. The fourth and fifth names she reached on Wednesday. The sixth and seventh she sent letters to, because she had run out of day and the mule was not inexhaustible, and because she'd already done the arithmetic, and she was close enough now that the 2 in-hand contracts could cover the gap if she was careful. She was always careful. She had made careful into a habit the way other people made habits of prayer or drink or worry, something you return to without thinking because it had become structural. Thursday arrived. She had the money. Not comfortably, not with room, not without a few days this week when she'd held her breath and hoped the math held, but she had it. The contracts had paid. One of the new ranchers had sent cash ahead with his ranch hand on Wednesday evening, and when she laid it all out on the kitchen table on Thursday morning and counted it with Maisie sitting across from her watching the coins in a way that suggested she was absorbing a lesson about money that Eliza hadn't consciously intended to teach, the total cleared what she owed by $6.20. $6.20. More than she'd had left over in any month since Daniel died. She put the debt payment in an envelope and went to the bank at 10 o'clock. Vance's clerk received her. Vance himself was in a meeting, the clerk said, and she could see through the half-open office door that this was true. There was another man in there, heavy-set, someone she didn't recognize. She didn't wait. She handed the envelope to the clerk, asked for a written receipt, received it, confirmed it was correct, and left. She stood outside the bank on the frozen wooden walkway for a moment, receipt in hand, and she thought about Daniel, She did that sometimes in moments like this. Not sentimentally, not with the gutting grief that had characterized the first year, but something quieter, more like a conversation she was still having with someone who wasn't there to respond. She thought, look at this. We're still here. She thought, Maisie's fine, she's doing fine. Then she put the receipt in her coat pocket and walked back toward the cabin, because there was work to do and the morning was half gone already. The weeks that followed built on themselves in the way that good periods do, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the steady accumulation of small things going right. The ranchers on Colton's list turned into regular clients. Martha Hargrove's dinner invitation materialized into an actual evening with 3 other women she hadn't met before, 2 of whom had ranch operations of their own, and 1 of whom was the wife of a timber merchant and had connections Eliza hadn't anticipated. She went home from that dinner with 2 new introductions and a standing invitation to return, and she thought about it on the ride back in a way that was almost unfamiliar to her, not calculating what it might produce, just appreciating that it had happened. She and Colton fell into a rhythm that was comfortable without either of them having decided to make it that way. He stopped by the cabin twice a week to drop off or collect work, and more often than not they talked at the door or occasionally at the kitchen table while Maisie drew letters from her primaire on a slate board with the intense concentration of someone performing surgery. They talked about the work and then about things adjacent to it, and then sometimes about things not adjacent to it at all. He was from Iowa originally, she learned. Not Kansas. He'd been in Kansas after, but he was born in Iowa, in a small farming community that had been hit badly by a series of bad seasons in the 70s. He'd been the eldest of 3. He'd been supporting the family since he was 12. Your mother, she said one evening, does she know what you've built here? He looked at the table for a moment. She died in '82. I'm sorry. She knew I was doing well. I'd written. She knew. He said it with the careful precision of someone who had made peace with something by working out exactly which parts of it were okay and which weren't, and keeping them separate. She knew. Eliza didn't push. She understood that particular architecture of grief, the way you organized it so you could keep functioning inside it, and she respected when someone had built it carefully. March brought a thaw that wasn't quite a thaw, the kind that promises spring and then revokes it, leaving mud that froze at night and softened during the day into the particular ankle-deep treachery that made every outdoor task twice as hard. Eliza had started keeping a ledger, a real one, not just the mental accounting she'd been running, and she studied it on Sunday evenings with the same seriousness she'd once applied to Daniel's account books. The numbers were not impressive by anyone else's standard, but they were moving in one direction now, consistently, without exception. In April, she hired a girl. She didn't decide to so much as discover she already had. The girl, Nora, 15, daughter of a farmer 4 miles out whose wife had died the previous fall and who had too many children and not enough income, and who had heard through the same informal network that had carried Eliza's name across the valley that Mrs. Whitmore might have work, showed up at the cabin door with her own needle kit and a look of determined calm that reminded Eliza of someone she couldn't immediately place and then realized was herself 4 years ago. She was not particularly skilled. Eliza was honest with herself about this, but she was fast, and she was careful, and she asked good questions, and she didn't make the same mistake twice, which was, in Eliza's assessment, the actual non-negotiable qualification. Skill you could teach. The willingness not to repeat errors, that either was in someone or it wasn't. She paid Nora 30 cents a day. It was not much. It was more than nothing and considerably more than whatever Nora's father could spare. And when she brought the arrangement to Nora's father and laid it out, not asking permission, exactly, but informing him as a courtesy, the man looked at her with an expression she recognized as the particular gratitude of someone who has too much pride to ask for help and has just had the necessity removed without having to. She's a good girl, he said. I can see that, Eliza said. I'll have her home by dark. Colton noticed Nora on his next visit and said nothing about it except to ask if the extra pair of hands was helping with turnaround time. She told him it was. He nodded as if he'd expected as much and asked about the Hargrove order, and they moved on and she filed away without dwelling on it, the fact that he had not made a thing of it, had not congratulated her or commented on her progress, or done any of the things people do when they want credit for the circumstances that led to something. He had simply taken it as a development in an ongoing enterprise and asked the relevant question. She found herself thinking about that quality of his more often than was strictly necessary. The trouble when it came sideways, the way trouble in a small town usually does, not from the direction you're watching. She had been in Harlan's Creek for a month now, with a level of financial stability she'd never had here, with more work than she could manage alone even with Nora's help, with a dinner invitation from Martha Hargrove once a month, and a small but real social presence that she'd spent 2 years without. She was not naive enough to think this was permanent or that the ground beneath it was solid in the way she wanted it to be. She had too much recent experience of solid ground becoming otherwise. The first sign was a conversation she overheard at the general store on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. She was waiting at the counter while the store owner, Briggs, wrapped an order she'd placed, and 2 women she knew by sight but not well came in and stood near the fabric rolls at the far side of the room. They didn't see her, or didn't register her, which was different. "Heard she's taking work from Patterson now," one of them said. He had the Renner family for years. "Renner switched to her in February, I think. Patterson's not happy about it." "Well," the second woman's voice dropped slightly, which paradoxically made it easier for Eliza to hear. "It's one thing when she was just doing mending, but she's undercutting established trade. And she's got that girl working for her now, and the girl's not from here. Nora Hicks. The father's been here since '81. He just doesn't come to town much." "That's not what I mean." A pause. "I just mean people are starting to talk about what she's actually building, and some people think it's a bit much for a widow." Briggs set her wrapped order on the counter. She paid for it without turning toward the women, because she didn't trust what her face was doing, and she thanked him and walked out. She stood on the walkway in the spring sun with her package under her arm and breathed through it. A bit much for a widow. She recognized the phrasing. It wasn't cruelty. It was almost worse than cruelty, because cruelty you could get angry at and anger was useful. This was something more ambient than cruelty. The particular way a frontier town maintained its social order by gently noting when someone was operating outside their designated role. A widow's role was to struggle quietly and accept what was offered and be grateful for small mercies. A widow who built something was not threatening, exactly, just a bit much. She walked home. She set the package down. She looked at the ledger on the table and the sewing machine in the corner and Maisie's primer open on the chair. Then she picked up the next order in the pile and got to work. Because what else was she going to do? The machine didn't know about the women in the general store. The work didn't know. Nora was coming tomorrow morning, and there were 3 orders due by Friday, and the numbers in the ledger were pointing the right direction, and she was 19 days from having cleared her debt entirely, and absolutely none of that cared about a bit much for a widow. She worked until the lamp oil ran low, and then she went to bed, and in the morning she got up and worked again. But the comment stayed. It sat at the back of her mind the way a small pebble in a boot stays. Not incapacitating, not dramatic, just consistently present, reminding you with every step that something is not quite right, that the ground you're standing on still has people on it who'd prefer you weren't standing quite so tall. She did not mention it to Colton when he came by that Thursday. She nearly did. There was a moment when she was about to, and then she didn't, because she wasn't sure what she wanted from telling him. And she'd learned enough about herself in the last 2 years to know that when she didn't know what she wanted from a conversation, it was better to wait until she did. What she wanted, she figured out on the walk home from the Hargrove dinner in early May, was to not need to mention it. What she wanted was to build the thing large enough that a bit much for a widow became simply a business, a fact of the valley's commercial life, unremarkable, established, as permanent seeming as anything could be out here. She was not there yet. She knew she wasn't there yet. But the distance between where she was standing and where she needed to be was no longer the same distance it had been on that February morning when Harold Vance walked into her cabin without knocking and looked at her sewing machine like it was already gone. That distance had closed, not enough, but measurably. She kept walking, she kept sewing, she kept going, and the sewing machine stayed exactly where it was. The thing about Patterson was that nobody talked about him directly. That was how Eliza knew he was the one behind it. In a small town, when something starts going wrong for you and nobody will look you in the eye about it, you learn to read the shape of what's missing. The Renner family sent a note in the second week of May saying they'd be suspending their orders for the time being. No explanation, no apology, just that phrase, polished and evasive, the kind of language people use when they've been told what to say, but not how to say it comfortably. 2 days later, a ranch out on the North Road that had been about to contract with her sent word through a third party that they'd made other arrangements. Then old Briggs at the general store told her, without meeting her eyes, that he'd need to stop extending her the small credit line he'd quietly maintained since February. None of these people were her enemies. That was the complicated part. Renner was a decent man who'd always paid on time and once lent her his cart when the mule went lame. The woman who ran deliveries for the North Road Ranch had smiled at her genuinely every time they'd crossed paths in town. Briggs had been nothing but kind. But something had moved through the community like a current moving through water. Invisible, sourceless seeming, but real and cold. And these people were responding to it the way people respond to things they feel but can't articulate, which is to make small, quiet adjustments and hope nobody notices. She noticed. She had been in Harlan's Creek long enough now to understand its social mechanics, and she understood that Patterson, Gerald Patterson, who had run the only established sewing and alterations business in town for 11 years, and who had, until Eliza started taking his clients, enjoyed the comfortable monopoly of someone with no real competition, was not the type of man to confront a problem directly. He was the type to have conversations, to mention things over drinks, to make observations to the right people, to work the invisible levers of a small community's social order with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it so long he probably didn't recognize it as deliberate anymore. She had not taken his clients intentionally. That was the truth of it, the truth she kept returning to when the unfairness of it sat too heavily. She had not set out to displace him. She had set out to survive, and the work she did was better than his, and cost approximately the same, and people had chosen accordingly. That was commerce. That was simply how it was supposed to work. But Patterson didn't see it as commerce. He saw it as a widow who should have known her place taking something that belonged to him, and he was making that feeling known in the way men like him did, quietly, pervasively, without a single thing you could point to and say, "There, that is the thing he did." She told Colton on a Thursday evening in mid-May. She hadn't planned to, she was still working out what she wanted from telling him. But he arrived to pick up a delivery, and she was more tired than she'd realized, and it came out while she was handing him the wrapped package, matter-of-factly, the way things come out when you've been carrying them too long. He listened without interrupting. He did that consistently, and she had come to depend on it more than she wanted to admit. "Patterson," he said when she was done. "I can't prove it." "You don't need to prove it to know it." He set the package down on the step. "Has he said anything to you directly?" "He wouldn't." She crossed her arms against the evening chill. "He's never once spoken to me directly. I don't think I exist to him except as a problem to be managed." Colton was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking, not performing thought, actually doing it, which was a distinction she'd learned to read in him. "I know Patterson," he said finally. "He's done this before. There was a man who set up a leather goods operation about 4 years back, came in from Wyoming, did good work. Patterson was friendly to his face for about 2 months, and then the man's clients started drifting back one by one, and by fall he'd packed up and left." He paused. The man never knew exactly what had happened. "I know what's happening," Eliza said. "Yes." He looked at her. "That's different." She was about to say something else when Maisie appeared in the doorway behind her, pressing against Eliza's back with the weight of a child who has been trying not to interrupt and has reached the limit of that effort. "Mr. Reeves," she said formally. "Miss Maisie." He had the same grave courtesy with the child that he had with adults, which Maisie found deeply satisfying. Eliza had noticed this months ago, the way her daughter stood slightly taller in his presence, responding to being taken seriously. "Are you staying for supper?" Eliza started to say he wasn't, but Colton said, "If there's enough," at the same moment, and Maisie looked between them with the alert calculation of a 6-year-old who has identified an opportunity. "There's enough," Maisie said. There was enough. Barely, but she made it work, the way she made most things work, through management and without complaint. And they ate at the small table with Maisie between them, doing most of the talking, narrating the letters she'd learned that week from the primer with the earnest enthusiasm of someone who has recently discovered that written language is a system and not a mystery, and who finds this revelation deeply exciting. Colton asked her questions. Real ones, not the performative kind adults ask children. He asked what she found hard about letters, and Maisie said the letter Q because it looked like it was about to fall over, and he considered this seriously and said that was a fair observation. Eliza watched this from across the table and ate her supper and felt something she didn't examine too carefully. After Maisie was in bed, they sat at the cleared table with coffee, and she said, "What would you do? About Patterson?" He turned his cup. "What do you want to do?" "I want to keep building what I'm building. I don't want to spend energy fighting a man who won't even fight me face to face." She set her cup down. "But I can feel the ground shifting, and I don't know how far it goes or how fast." "It goes as far as he can push it," Colton said, "which is limited because Patterson's influence is basically the social circle of this town, and your work goes further than that circle. The ranches out on the east and north roads don't care what Patterson thinks. Hargrove doesn't care. Cobb doesn't care." He looked at her steadily. "The question is whether the clients in town are enough to matter to your overall business." She had done this math. She'd done it 3 days ago when the pattern first became clear. "They matter," she said. "Not critically, but they matter." He nodded. "Then we make sure the part that does matter is strong enough that the part that doesn't can't shake it." She wasn't sure if she found this comforting or frustrating. Probably both. It was the correct analysis, and correct analysis doesn't always feel good when the problem it describes is real and present and sitting in your chest like a stone. "I'll talk to some people," he said. "Don't fight my battles for me." "I'm not proposing to." He said it without defensiveness. "I'm proposing to mention to people whose opinion Patterson respects that Mrs. Whitmore does exceptional work, because that is a true thing, and it is the kind of true thing that is useful for people to know." He paused. "That's not fighting your battle. That's commerce." She looked at him for a moment. "You're very precise about the line between helping and interfering." "I've thought about it," he said simply. And she believed him. June arrived with real warmth, finally, the tentative, grudging warmth of a Montana spring that has taken its time and is not apologizing for it. The pastures went from brown to green with an abruptness that always surprised Eliza, no matter how many times she'd seen it, as if the land had been waiting with contained impatience and then simply decided it was done waiting. Nora had been with her 3 months now, and the girl had developed in ways that Eliza hadn't quite anticipated. Her technical skills had improved substantially. She'd been a fast learner, and she'd absorbed correction well, which Eliza had expected, but what Eliza hadn't expected was the quality of her attention. Nora noticed things. She noticed when a client's preferences shifted, when a material wasn't behaving the way it should, when a pattern would create problems at the seams before those problems materialized. She had, Eliza thought, what her mother would have called an eye, the spatial intuition that either existed in someone or didn't, and couldn't be taught from outside. She raised Nora's pay to 40 cents a day in June without being asked, because the work warranted it, and because she remembered what it felt like to do good work for wages that told you the work wasn't valued. Nora received this news with a composure that was clearly covering a significant amount of feeling, and excused herself to the back of the cabin for a few minutes, and returned with red eyes she didn't acknowledge, and they continued working without discussing it, which was exactly right. The Patterson problem settled into a low-grade persistent pressure rather than an acute crisis. She lost 2 more town clients in June, a merchant's wife and the school teacher, who had been one of her earliest customers, and who she suspected had not wanted to switch, but had been caught in some social current she felt unable to resist. She gained 3 ranch contracts that more than compensated financially. She was, on balance, growing. But the growing felt effortful in a way it hadn't before, like walking with a headwind that you couldn't see but could constantly feel. She ran into Patterson himself in late June, which she hadn't done since the winter. He was coming out of the post office as she was going in, and there was a half-second where neither of them could pretend not to have seen the other. He was a compact man, somewhere around 50, with the careful presentation of someone who understood that appearance was part of his trade. He dressed well. He was not an ugly person. He nodded at her with the specific neutrality of someone performing the social minimum. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Mr. Patterson." He moved to go around her and she said, before she'd decided to, "I'd like to talk to you if you have a minute." He stopped. She could see him recalibrating. "I'm in a hurry," he said. "I know." She kept her voice level. "This won't take long." She stepped slightly to the side, away from the door, giving him the option to join her without it being a public confrontation. He could walk away. She was giving him the out deliberately, because she wasn't trying to embarrass him. She genuinely wasn't. She just needed to say this to his face, needed the conversation to exist, even briefly, even unresolved, even uncomfortable. He stepped toward her. Not far. 2 feet. The posture of a man who has agreed to hear something but is not agreeing to anything beyond that. I'm not trying to take what's yours, she said. I want you to know that. I have a child and I needed work, and I did the work I know how to do. I didn't set out to compete with you. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not hostile, not conciliatory, assessing. People made choices, she continued. I can't help that. But I'm not your enemy, and whatever's been happening this spring, I'd rather it stopped, and I'd rather say that to your face than pretend I don't know it's been happening. A long pause. Enough that she began to think he wasn't going to respond at all. You do good work, he said finally. He said it the way someone admits a thing they'd rather not admit, without enthusiasm, but precisely. Better than mine on the technical side, I won't argue that. Another pause. This is a small town, Mrs. Whitmore. I know it is. There's not enough work for 2 full operations. I think there might be, she said. If the territory keeps growing, the new settlements coming in from the east, maybe. He said it with the tone of someone filing something away to consider later. Maybe. He left without committing to anything. She watched him go and felt, not triumphant, not even particularly hopeful, but steadier than she'd felt in the weeks since the trouble started. She had said what she meant to his face, and it had not destroyed her, and he had said something honest in return, and sometimes that was all a difficult conversation could be, and it was still worth having. She went into the post office and collected her mail and walked home. The letter was among the mail, and she didn't open it until she was back at the cabin, and then she stood in the doorway for a moment after she'd read it and tried to figure out what she was feeling. It was from the Billings Merchant and Trade Association. A brief letter, formal and businesslike, informing her that her name had been submitted by Mr. Colton Reeves and Mr. Robert Hargrove for consideration as a supplier to the association's member network, and that they would like to schedule a meeting at her earliest convenience to discuss terms. The Billings Association. She knew of it. Everyone in the territory knew of it, the same way you knew of things that were slightly beyond your current circumstance, but not so far beyond that you stopped paying attention to them. The association connected suppliers to buyers across a network that stretched from Billings east and north, touching settlements she'd never set foot in. A supplier on the association's list got exposure she could not otherwise reach, business she could not otherwise find. She read the letter twice and then set it on the table and put water on the stove for coffee, because she needed a minute before she let herself feel the full weight of it. Colton had done this. And Hargrove, Martha's husband, who had shaken her hand at the dinner in March and said plainly that he'd recommend her anywhere, had done it with him. She hadn't known. They hadn't told her. She was not sure how she felt about that. Part of her felt the automatic resistance she felt whenever someone acted on her behalf without her knowledge, the prickling sense of agency circumvented even when the circumventing was well-intentioned. She had been fighting that battle all year, the battle for the right to be the one who directed her own life. And any action taken without her input, however well-meant, rubbed against that grain. But another part of her, the part that was tired and had been fighting headwinds for months, and could do the arithmetic of what the association's network could mean for her business and for Maisie's future. That part was simply, quietly, enormously grateful. She brought both parts of herself to Colton's ranch the following Saturday. She'd sent a note ahead and he was expecting her, which meant when she arrived she was shown into the ranch office rather than left to wait, and the office was tidy in the way of a man who managed things carefully and didn't feel the need to perform tidiness beyond what it actually required. "You didn't tell me," she said when they were sitting. "No." He didn't apologize for it. "I wasn't certain they'd respond, and I didn't want to set an expectation that didn't materialize." "That's a reasonable explanation," she said. "It doesn't entirely resolve the fact that you acted without discussing it with me first." He looked at her steadily. "You're right." She hadn't expected that to be his first response. She'd expected a defense, a good defense, a reasonable defense, because his position was defensible. The fact that he didn't reach for it first said something she needed a moment to process. "I should have told you what I was considering," he said, "even with the uncertainty. It was your business and your name, and I made a decision about both of them without asking. That was wrong. She sat with that for a moment. The coffee on the desk between them was steaming and neither of them touched it. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For not arguing about it." She picked up her coffee. "I've spent 2 years watching people decide things about my life without asking. I'm somewhat reactive about it." "That seems proportionate," he said. She almost smiled. "Yes, it does." He asked her then about the meeting, whether she intended to go, what she'd need, how she wanted to approach it. He had information about the association that she didn't, having done business with several of its members. And he shared it the way he shared most things, plainly, without editorializing, leaving her to draw her own conclusions. She asked questions. He answered them. She took notes on a small paper she'd brought for the purpose. It was, she thought, the most useful conversation she'd had in months. And it was also, she noticed this without dwelling on it, a conversation between two people who had stopped pretending that the space between them was purely professional. Not that they addressed that directly. They didn't. But the pretense had quietly dissolved somewhere in the months of Maisie asking him to dinner, and the letter about his mother in Kansas, and the way he'd said, "You're right," when most men would have argued, and its absence now was simply present in the room with them, acknowledged without language, the way certain things between people are. She rode back to the cabin in the long summer evening and made supper and put Maisie to bed and sat at the machine for an hour after. Not because she had anything urgent, but because the rhythm of it helped her think. The association meeting was in 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to prepare, to put together samples, to document her pricing, to be able to speak concisely and specifically about her capacity and her turnaround and the quality of her work. She also had Patterson's quiet campaign still running in the background, and 3 clients she'd lost and couldn't recover without Patterson's cooperation, and the awareness that whatever the association meeting produced, she would still be living in Harlan's Creek and still subject to the social current that ran through it. She was working through all of this, the forward planning, the ongoing problems, the shape of the next several months, when she heard something outside. Not a knock. A sound, lower and less deliberate than a knock. Something against the outer wall of the cabin. She stopped the machine and listened. Silence. Then the sound again, a kind of scraping, irregular. She went to the window and looked out, and the street was empty, and the night was dark, but not pitch dark, a half moon giving enough light to see by if she knew what she was looking at. She waited. There, at the corner of the cabin, a figure moving along the wall, not toward the door, but along the side of the building toward the back where her small storage lean-to was attached, where she kept finished inventory and the materials she'd built up over the past months. The bolts of wool and canvas she'd invested in at real cost, the organized stockpile that represented months of careful purchasing. She crossed to the door. She picked up the poker from beside the stove because it was the only thing to hand. She opened the door. "Who's there?" Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. A scrambling sound, then running footsteps on the frozen ground, retreating. She went around the side of the cabin. The lean-to door was open. She had latched it. She always latched it. She was meticulous about the lean-to because what was inside it was not replaceable without significant expense and time. The latch was broken, the wood splintered near the screws. Someone had forced it. She held the lamp inside. Everything appeared to be there, nothing obviously missing, but several of the stacked bolts had been disturbed, shoved aside, not reorganized, in the way of someone looking for something specific rather than taking things at random. She stood there in the cold with the lamp and the poker and tried to think clearly. What was someone looking for? She had no money stored here. She had materials, finished goods, her tools. The machine itself was inside the cabin. There was nothing in the lean-to that had value to anyone but herself, unless someone understood her business well enough to know that destroying her stockpile would cost her weeks of work and income she couldn't afford to lose. Someone who understood her business. She set the lamp down carefully and stood very still in the cold and thought about Gerald Patterson, who she had confronted face-to-face 2 weeks ago, and who had said, "You do good work," with the tone of someone admitting something they'd rather not, and who had said maybe about the possibility of the territory growing enough for both of them, and who had not said he'd stop what he'd been doing. She thought, maybe. She thought, or maybe someone else entirely. A drifter. A random opportunist. She thought, the latch didn't break randomly. Latches don't break randomly from the outside. She went back inside, checked that Maisie was sleeping. She was one arm thrown over the quilt, entirely undisturbed, and sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and thought about what to do. She could go to the sheriff. She had thought about this before, had considered it when the social pressure campaign first started, and had decided against it because she had no evidence beyond the pattern of small withdrawals, which was not the kind of evidence a sheriff in a frontier town was equipped to act on. This was different. This was a broken latch and a disturbed stockpile. This was physical. This was something she could point to, but who had done it she could not prove. And without being able to point to who, she was a widow reporting a break-in that produced no actual theft, which would be noted and possibly sympathized with and then filed away. She needed a different approach. She thought about the association letter on the table. She thought about the 7 ranchers on Colton's list, the dinner at Hargrove's, Nora coming in the morning, the ledger that had been moving steadily in one direction for 4 months. She thought, I have built something here, not large, not unassailable, but real. She thought, someone just tried to tell me to stop building it. She picked a pen and began writing. Not to the sheriff, not yet. A letter to Colton first because she needed to tell someone who would take it seriously without taking it over, and because the morning was a long way off and she needed to put the events into words in some form, or they would sit in her chest and grow into something she couldn't manage. She wrote what had happened, exactly and without dramatics. She described the broken latch, the disturbed materials, the retreating footsteps. She wrote that she did not know who had done it and that she would not accuse without evidence. She wrote, I am not going to stop. I want you to know that. Whatever tonight was intended to communicate, I am not going to stop. She set the letter down and looked at it for a moment. Then she added, at the bottom, in handwriting that was less careful than the rest because she was tired and the hour was late and she was past the point of managing appearances. Thank you for the association letter, even though you should have told me first. Thank you. She sealed the letter and set it by the door to send in the morning. Then she put another log in the stove and went back to the machine, and she worked until the lamp oil ran low again and the cold crept in under the door, and Maisie shifted in her sleep on the other side of the wall, and the needle moved and the seam held, because the seam always held when you set it right, and she was done letting this town tell her what she was and wasn't allowed to build. Colton arrived the next morning before 8. She hadn't expected him that fast. She'd sent the letter with Nora's younger brother, who ran errands for small coin and who she'd caught on the street at first light heading toward the East Road. But the knock came while she was still at the stove, and when she opened the door, he was there in his working coat, his horse still blowing steam at the fence post. He read her face before she said anything. That was something she'd noticed about him over the months. He read situations the way she read fabric, by looking at the thing directly and without assumption, taking in what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. Show me, he said. She took him around to the lean-to. He crouched at the broken latch and examined it without touching it, then stood and looked at the disturbed inventory inside. He asked a few questions: what time she'd heard it, which direction the footsteps went, whether she'd seen anything before the figure at the corner. His voice was even. He was not performing calm. He simply was calm, and it steadied her in a way she wouldn't have admitted to needing. The footsteps went toward the alley behind the feed store, she said. I couldn't see far enough to tell more than that. He nodded. He looked at the broken latch again. Someone knew what they were doing. This wasn't random. I know. You think Patterson. I think I don't know. She was precise about this because she had been precise about it all night, lying awake being precise about it, refusing to let the certainty she felt harden into accusation without evidence. It's the most logical explanation. It could also be coincidence, bad timing, someone who saw an opportunity, and I'm connecting things that aren't connected. Do you believe that? She looked at him. No, but I'm not going to say it out loud to anyone else until I have something more than a broken latch and a feeling. He stood quiet for a moment. She could see him turning something over, not arguing with her reasoning, just processing it. The association meeting is in 2 weeks, he said. I know that too. If this was Patterson, the timing makes sense. Word gets around in this town. He'll know about the letter. She had thought about this during the night as well. The association's letter had been delivered through the post office. Briggs ran the post office counter 2 days a week when the regular postmaster was out. Briggs, who had quietly closed her small credit line in May. Briggs, who was not her enemy, but who was caught in Patterson's orbit in ways he probably hadn't fully chosen. "How much damage did they do?" Colton asked. "None, actually. Whatever they were looking for, they didn't find it or didn't take it. Everything's accounted for." She paused. "Which is almost more unsettling than if something had been taken. It feels like a message." "It is a message." "I know what it is." She heard the edge in her own voice and modulated it, not because she felt she needed to manage herself in front of him, but because the edge wasn't directed at him, and it was unfair to let it land there. "I'm just not going to respond to it the way it expects me to." He looked at her for a moment with that direct, considering look she'd stopped finding disconcerting months ago. "What are you going to do?" "Fix the latch," she said. "Go to the association meeting. Keep working." She crossed her arms against the morning chill. "And pay a visit to the sheriff today. Not because I expect him to do anything, but because I want it on record. I want there to be a record." Something shifted in his expression. Something that wasn't quite approval, because approval implied he was in a position to grant or withhold it, and they both knew he wasn't, but something that recognized what she'd said as the right instinct. "I'll come with you," he said. "You don't need—" "I know I don't need to." He said it quietly, not pushing. "But Sheriff Crane takes things more seriously when they involve property belonging to someone whose operation he can't easily ignore. My presence makes your report harder to file away." She wanted to object to this. The objection was principled, and she believed in it. That her account should carry the same weight as any other person's account. That her word about her own property should not require a man's presence to be believed. She believed all of that. And she also knew it was 1887 in a frontier town, and the principle and the reality were not the same thing, and she was tired enough from the night and the months before it to choose the reality today. "Fine," she said, "but I do the talking." "I assumed," he said. Sheriff Crane was a broad, unhurried man in his mid-50s who had the permanent look of someone who had seen enough that very little surprised him anymore. He received them in his office, received Eliza, who he clearly recognized, and Colton, whom he clearly knew and seemed to take a slight inventory of in an assessing way, and listened to Eliza's account of the break-in with the particular quality of attention that might have been genuine or might have been its professional imitation. She couldn't tell. She reported the facts, the time, the sound, the broken latch, the disturbed materials, the retreating figure, the direction of flight. She did not mention Patterson. When she was done, Crane leaned back and folded his hands on his desk. "Nothing was taken," he said. "No. So what you're reporting is a broken latch and an intruder who left without taking anything. And a property that was entered without my permission and searched. Yes." She kept her voice level. "I understand that no theft occurred. I'm reporting it because I want it documented, and because whoever did this will know it's been documented." Crane looked at her for a moment, then at Colton, then back at her. "You have someone in mind?" "I have no one I can name with evidence," she said. Another pause. He picked up a pen and pulled a sheet toward him. "I'll make a note. Can't promise an investigation without more to go on." He began writing. "You put a new latch on?" "This morning, yes. Keep your doors locked." He said it not unkindly. "I'll ask around. Someone might have seen something on the alley side. Perkins is usually up early on that end of town." It was less than she'd hoped for and more than she'd expected. She thanked him and they left, and outside on the street Colton said nothing and she said nothing for a moment, both of them adjusting to the particular flatness of having done the correct thing and found it insufficient. "Perkins won't have seen anything useful," she said. "Probably not. But there's a report now." "There's a report," he confirmed. She nodded, mostly to herself, and went home to work. The week before the association meeting was the busiest she could remember in the 14 months since she'd started building the business. She had 4 contracts in progress simultaneously, Nora working 6 days instead of 5 at Eliza's request, and Nora's willing agreement, and she was also preparing her presentation materials, samples, pricing documentation, a summary of her capacity and turnaround times written in plain, specific language, because she had no interest in dressing it up and every interest in being believed. Martha Hargrove came by on a Wednesday with a basket of food she described as surplus from the kitchen in a tone that made clear it wasn't, and stayed for 2 hours, which Eliza initially worried would cost her work time and then found was actually useful. Martha had dealt with the association members socially, as her husband had done business with several of them, and she gave Eliza information she wouldn't have had otherwise. Which men were interested in price, which in reliability, which in the personal connection that frontier business still ran on underneath all the formal structures. "Henderson is the one to get," Martha said. She was sitting at the kitchen table eating the biscuits she'd brought herself, apparently finding this unremarkable. "If Henderson thinks well of you, 2 or 3 others follow automatically. He's cautious, but he's fair. Colton mentioned Henderson. He did work with him last year. He'll tell you the same thing." Martha refilled her own coffee without asking, which Eliza had come to understand was simply how Martha operated and was actually a kind of compliment. She was comfortable enough not to perform the small formalities. "Robert says Reeves has talked to Henderson about you already." Eliza's hand stilled slightly on the seam she was checking. "Did he?" "Apparently." Martha watched her with an expression that was carefully not an expression. "Is that a problem?" "It depends on what he said." "Robert said he told Henderson you were the most reliable supplier he'd worked with in the territory, and that he'd put his name to your work without qualification." Martha paused. "Which is Colton Reeves, who does not say things like that lightly or often, so I imagine it landed." Eliza went back to the seam. She was processing several things at once: gratitude, which she'd decided months ago to simply accept rather than fight; something more complicated that she wasn't going to examine with Martha Hargrove sitting 6 feet away, and a practical question about how to present herself to Henderson in a way that built on rather than relied upon whatever Colton had said. "I want to stand on my own work," she said. "Of course you do." Martha said it without condescension. "You will. But standing on your own work and having someone open the door aren't mutually exclusive." She set down her cup. "You know that. You're just working out whether to feel grateful or complicated about it." Eliza looked at her. "You're more perceptive than you let on." "I let on quite a lot," Martha said mildly. "You've just been too busy to notice." The association meeting was held in Billings, in the back room of the Merchants Building on a Wednesday morning in early July. Colton rode with her. She had negotiated the terms of this in her head before he offered, so when he offered, she simply said yes, which surprised him slightly, which she found satisfying in a small way. The wagon ride was 4 hours each way, and it rained for the first 2, a light, persistent rain that the canvas cover mostly handled. They talked during the ride. Not about the meeting, or not mainly. They'd covered the practical ground already, and she didn't want to arrive over-rehearsed and stiff. They talked about other things. He told her about the first winter he'd spent in Montana, before he had the ranch house, camping in a lean-to he'd built himself because the timber had been all wrong, and he'd had to rebuild it twice before it stopped leaking. She told him about the train journey west with Daniel before Maisie was born, how she'd watched the landscape change through the window, and understood somewhere in central Kansas that she was leaving her mother's world permanently, and what that felt like. He listened to this in the particular way he listened to things that mattered. No comment, no reaching for silver linings, just the listening itself. By the time the rain stopped and they came into Billings through the morning, she felt herself to be exactly who she was, and that was the right way to arrive. The meeting room held 5 men. Henderson was the one she'd prepared for. Compact, 60-something, with the contained, evaluating manner of a man whose business success came from reading people accurately over a long career. He shook her hand when she came in, which not all 5 did, and she noted this as information. He introduced the others, whose names she attached immediately to the notes Martha had given her. Colton sat to the side and behind her, not at the table, which was his idea, and which was correct, visible enough to signal his endorsement, positioned clearly as a supporter rather than a speaker. She had placed her samples on the table before the men came in. She had arranged them deliberately, the most technically complex piece in the center, where eyes would naturally go. Henderson picked it up first. She had expected this. He turned it over in his hands. He had thick, work-roughened hands that looked wrong for a merchant, until you understood that he'd started as a laborer and built the association from the ground up over 30 years. And he looked at the sample with hands that still knew how things were made. "The saddlebag," he said. "Custom design," she said. "The original patterns is mine. The stitching pattern on the flap is also my design. It distributes tension across the hinge point differently than the standard method. It holds longer under load stress." He looked at her over the sample. "You tested this?" "My clients work their equipment hard every day. That's the test. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, some internal acknowledgement that got as far as the eyes before it was contained. One of the other men, she'd placed him as Riordan, the one Martha said was most interested in price, leaned forward. Your rates, Mrs. Whitmore. Reeves says they're fair. I'd like to hear your own assessment. She laid her pricing sheet on the table and walked them through it. She had structured it carefully. Not cheap, which would signal either desperation or poor quality, and not aspirational, which would signal someone who hadn't done the work of knowing what the market would bear. She named her rates with the confidence of someone who knew what the work was worth because she'd been doing it long enough to know. Riordan studied the sheet. Custom saddlebags at this price point. Patterson charges less. Patterson's work fails at the hinge within a season, she said. I know this because 3 of my current clients were Patterson's clients first and came to me with the damage. I can show you the repair records if that's useful. Riordan blinked. Henderson's almost smile got slightly closer to the surface. That's a fairly direct claim, Henderson said. It's a verifiable one, she said. I don't make claims I can't support. She'd been in the room for 40 minutes when Henderson set down the last sample and leaned back with the posture of a man who has arrived at a position. She'd watched him work through the samples methodically, ask 3 additional questions she'd answered without hedging, and exchange 2 glances with the man beside him that she'd read as favorable but hadn't been certain of. We'll need to formalize terms, he said. Standard supplier agreement, 30-day review at 6 months. Your capacity concerns me slightly. You're operating with 1 assistant in a cabin workshop. I'm in the process of expanding, she said. This was true in the sense that it was something she was actively planning, having worked through the numbers twice in the last week, and determined it was viable if she secured 2 or 3 association contracts. I have space and I have the ability to bring on additional trained workers when the volume requires it. You'd need to double your current output to meet the minimum volume we'd be looking at. I know. She'd done that math 40 times. I can do that within 90 days of a signed agreement. Henderson looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Colton, briefly, the first time he'd done so directly. Colton said nothing. He didn't nod, didn't signal, didn't perform endorsement. He simply sat there, present, which was its own signal. Henderson looked back at Eliza. We'll draw up a draft agreement. You'll have it within the week. She thanked him and the others, shook hands with the 2 who offered and nodded evenly to the ones who didn't, and she and Colton walked out of the merchant's building into the midday billing sun, and she stopped on the step and breathed once, deliberately, and let the air out slowly. Well, she said. Yes, he said. They found a place to eat before the ride back. She ordered a proper meal, the kind she'd been too careful with money to indulge in for months, and ate most of it, and Colton did the same, and they talked about the meeting with the particular ease of 2 people reviewing something that has gone well, and who are both too experienced to celebrate too early, but are allowing themselves the moment anyway. Henderson will sign, Colton said. He'd have ended the meeting sooner if he wasn't going to. He said 30-day review. Standard clause. He uses it with everyone. He renewed Hargrove's father's contract 5 years running without a single review meeting. He looked at his coffee. He liked you. He liked the saddlebag. He liked you, Colton said again, with a slight insistence that told her he meant something slightly different, and she let it land without deflecting. The ride home was quieter than the ride out. The rain had cleared and the road dried as the afternoon went on, and the light went long and golden, the way it did in Montana in July, the sky doing things with color that she had never seen in Ohio and had spent the first year here too miserable to appreciate. She appreciated them now. She had room for it now. Maisie was at Mrs. Pollard's next door and didn't need to be collected until after supper, so she had the cabin to herself when they arrived, and Colton came in to collect a bundle of finished work she'd had ready for his ranch, and they stood in the kitchen and she made coffee because the ride had been long and cold once the sun went down. He was looking at the letter she'd left on the table, the sheriff's receipt from the break-in report, which she'd pinned there as reminder to follow up with Crane next week. She saw him see it. Crane won't do much, he said. I know. I've been thinking about Patterson. She looked at him. What kind of thinking? The association contract, if it comes through, largely removes him as a threat. You'll have volume and supply chains and buyers he doesn't have access to. He can keep working the town's social network, and it won't touch you the same way. That's one future, she said. It's the most likely one. He set down his cup. But I don't like leaving the break-in unaddressed. I don't like the idea that he, or whoever it was, did that and faced no consequence. I don't like it either. I've been considering going to speak to him directly. She looked at him steadily. No. He held her gaze. Eliza, no. She kept her voice even, but there was nothing soft about it. I hear you. I understand why you want to. But if you go to Patterson on my behalf, you confirm the thing he already believes, that I am someone who needs a man to manage my problems. That undoes something. She paused. More than that. If I need someone to go to Patterson for me, I should be the one to decide that. And I've already talked to him directly once. Colton was quiet for a moment. He had the expression she'd come to recognize as him actually reconsidering rather than waiting her out. All right, he said. Just like that? You're not wrong. He said it with the same flat honesty he'd used months ago when she'd confronted him about the association letter. I don't like it, but you're not wrong. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the room she'd been aware of for a while now, and had been, by mutual unspoken agreement, letting exist without examination. It had been easier to do that when they were both busy and the problems were urgent, and there was always something to focus on that wasn't this. Standing in the kitchen in the quiet after a long day, with Maisie at the neighbors and the coffee going cold, and the association meeting still warm in the back of her mind, it was harder. What are we doing? She said. She asked it plainly, the way she asked most things. Not dramatically, not hoping to be reassured, just wanting to know. He looked at her. He did not pretend to misunderstand the question. I don't know exactly, he said. I know what I'd like to be doing. He said it carefully, not pushing, holding the statement at a remove that gave her room. But that's not a decision I'd make for you. No, she agreed. It's not. She thought about Daniel, not with grief this time, but with the particular kind of regard you have for someone who shaped you and is gone, and who you are still partly becoming without them. She thought about what she'd been building for the last year and a half, and what it had cost, and what it meant that it was still standing. I'm not the same person I was when I came here, she said. I don't know what I want in the same way I used to know things. That seems fair, he said. I'm telling you that because it's honest, not because it's an answer. I know the difference. She believed him. That was the thing she kept coming back to, the quality of him she kept returning to as though testing it. She believed him, specifically and consistently, which was not a thing she gave freely or had always been able to say about people. She picked up her coffee, and it was cold, so she set it down again. Ask me again in the spring, she said. It was not a refusal. They both understood it was not a refusal. Something in his face settled. Not relief, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized the gift in being asked to wait rather than being told no. All right, he said. He collected his bundle and left, and she watched the fence post until he was gone, and then she went next door to collect her daughter, who was already half asleep against Mrs. Pollard's parlor chair, and who allowed herself to be carried home with the limp cooperation of a child who has decided to trust the carrying. Eliza set her in bed and tucked the quilt around her and stood in the doorway for a moment. She thought about the association meeting, about Henderson and his work-roughened hands turning the saddlebag over in the light, about Riordan's face when she said Patterson's work failed at the hinge. She thought about the two women in Briggs's general store, their voices low and confident in their smallness. A bit much for a widow. She thought, watch. The association draft agreement arrived 9 days later, on a Tuesday, in a sealed envelope delivered through the post office. It was 12 pages long, and she read every word before she signed anything, which took her most of the afternoon. There were 3 clauses she wanted to modify. One regarding the timeline for the 6-month review, one around payment terms for custom orders, and one that gave the association broader rights to her pricing structure than she was comfortable with. She wrote her proposed modifications in careful language on a separate sheet, citing the specific clause number for each change, and sent it back with a cover letter that was courteous and specific and gave absolutely no indication that she felt anything other than entirely confident in her position, which was not exactly true but was the truth she needed to project. Henderson wrote back in 4 days. He accepted 2 of the 3 modifications, explained his reasoning on the third, and offered a compromise she found acceptable after thinking it through for one evening. She signed the agreement on a Thursday morning in late July, at the table where she'd done all her calculations and fought all her quiet battles, with Maisie sitting across from her drawing letters on the slate board, and Nora in the back working the machine, and the summer sun coming in through the window at an angle that made the room warmer than it had been in months. She set the pen down and looked at the signed document for a moment. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular solidity of someone who has set a stone in place in a wall they've been building for a long time, and who knows the wall is not done, and who finds, in that incompleteness, not discouragement, but reason to keep working. She folded the agreement, placed it in the tin box alongside the first letter Colton had written about the repair work and the bank extension and Daniel's death certificate, and closed the lid. "What was that?" Maisie asked. "A contract," Eliza said. "Is it good?" She thought about it, about Henderson and the association and the 2 new workers she was going to need by September, about Patterson and the broken latch and the retreating footsteps, and the long, unglamorous year it had taken to get from that cabin doorway to this kitchen table. "Yes," she said. "It's good?" Maisie nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her letters, and the machine hummed in the back room, and outside the July sun continued doing what it did, indifferent and beautiful, the way the country out here was, harsh and magnificent, and entirely uninterested in whether you survived it, which meant the surviving was entirely your own. Eliza got up and went to work. The 90 days she'd promised Henderson passed the way hard work always passes. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the particular compressed density of time that is fully occupied. You look up and it is October. The aspens have gone gold. The mornings have teeth again. She had hired 2 women by the end of August. The first was a woman named Clara Briggs. No relation to the store owner, she'd clarified with a dry humor that suggested she'd clarified it often, who was 38 and had been doing piecework for a Billings dressmaker at wages so poor they barely covered her room, and who came to Eliza's operation with skills that were genuinely impressive and a wariness that was entirely earned. Clara did not trust easily. Eliza did not ask her to. She paid her fairly, gave her specific work with specific expectations, and left her alone to do it. And within 3 weeks, Clara's wariness had not dissolved. It didn't dissolve, that wasn't who she was, but it had reorganized itself into something more like professional respect, which was, Eliza felt, considerably more durable than warmth. The second woman was older, 60-something, a widow named Agnes, who had been managing on a daughter's charity, and who had come to Eliza with her hat in her hands, in the way that people come when they have used up most of their pride and have decided the remaining portion isn't worth protecting at the cost of going hungry. She was slower than Nora and less technically refined than Clara, but she had steadiness. She showed up, she concentrated, she didn't make careless mistakes. And steadiness, Eliza had concluded from a 1.5 years of running a business on insufficient resources, was rarer and more valuable than brilliance. She had moved the operation out of the cabin. This had been the decision that felt most significant, more than the association contract, more than the new hires. Perhaps because the cabin was where all of it had started, where the machine had lived in the corner, and she'd worked by lamp oil, with Maisie asleep on the other side of the wall, and moving the work out of it meant something she couldn't entirely articulate, not leaving it behind, more like graduating it, like the cabin had held what needed holding, and now the thing had grown past what a cabin could contain. The new space was a storefront on the secondary street, not the main road. She wasn't paying main road rents yet. That had been used as a storage room by a dry goods operation that had closed in the spring. It was not large and it was not beautiful, and it smelled, for the first 3 weeks, of old flour. But it had 2 windows that let in proper light and room for 4 machines if she needed 4, and a small anteroom at the front where clients could come and discuss orders without standing in the doorway. She'd borrowed money for the first month's rent. From Colton. She'd asked him directly, told him the amount, told him the terms she was proposing for repayment, and waited. He'd said yes without drama, and she'd paid the first installment back 6 weeks later, on the date she'd specified, and he'd receipted it without comment, and that was how that had gone. She had told Maisie about the new space on the evening before they moved the machine. Maisie was 7 now, and she processed information about the business with the attentive seriousness of a child who had grown up understanding that the business was not separate from their lives, but was in fact the structure that held their lives together. She asked how many ladies would work there. She asked whether she could visit after school. She asked whether Mama would still be home for supper. Eliza answered all three questions honestly. 4, yes, and mostly. Maisie considered this. It sounds like growing, she said. It is, Eliza said. Is growing good or scary? She thought about that longer than a simpler answer would have required. Both, she said, usually at the same time. Maisie seemed to find this satisfactory, which meant she'd filed it alongside the other practical information she was assembling about how the world operated. She was a child who preferred accurate information to comforting information, which was something Eliza recognized in her and quietly valued, even when it made things harder. Patterson came to the new storefront in September. She was alone when he arrived. Clara and Agnes were out on a delivery errand. Nora was at the back finishing a set of blankets. And she heard the bell above the door and looked up from the cutting table. And there he was, standing in the anteroom in his good coat, holding his hat. He was holding his hat. She noted this because he had never removed his hat in her presence before, not once in any of the interactions they'd had. And the gesture was small, but it wasn't nothing. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Mr. Patterson. She set down her shears. I didn't expect to see you here. No, he said. I imagine not. He looked around the space, not the inventory look, not the way Vance had looked at her cabin, more like someone taking in a fact they'd been resisting and are now in the process of accepting. You've done well. She waited. People who came to say something difficult usually needed to come at it sideways first. He turned his hat in his hands. I owe you an apology. She was still. Not surprised, exactly. She had wondered, after the association contract and the 3 months of relative quiet that followed, whether he'd arrive at this, but surprised at the directness of it. The break-in, she said. Not a question, naming it because she wanted it named. He met her eyes. It cost him something. She could see that clearly. I didn't go myself. I want you to know that. I talked to someone who... The intention was to frighten you, not to damage anything. That's not a justification. I know it isn't. He stopped. I've been in business in this town for 11 years and I've never done anything like that. And I'm not telling you that because I want credit for it. I'm telling you because I need you to know it was an aberration and not... He stopped again. It wasn't who I am, whatever it looked like. She studied him. She was looking for the thing underneath the apology. Whether it was genuine or whether it was a man adjusting to a new power arrangement and performing contrition for strategic reasons. She had spent too many months reading people carefully not to look for this. What she saw was complicated. A man who had been genuinely frightened by her success in a way that had led him somewhere he hadn't intended to go, and who was now genuinely uncomfortable with where that somewhere had been. Not a good man, exactly. She didn't think that, but not a purely calculating one either. A human being with fear and pride and the particular capacity for self-deception that fear and pride together tend to produce. I appreciate you coming to say it, she said. She said it carefully, meaning it carefully, appreciating the act without forgiving the action, which were different things. The sheriff has a report. I know. I'm not withdrawing it. He nodded. He'd expected that, she thought. I'm not asking you to. She picked up her shears again, not dismissively, but because there was work on the table and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Is there something else? He cleared his throat. I wanted to say, I'm not going to work against you anymore. Whatever I was doing this spring. He said it plainly, without dressing it up, and she respected the plainness even if the content was coming much later than it should have. There's enough coming into this territory that we don't need to be taking from each other. I think I knew that, and I chose not to see it. She thought about the conversation she'd had with him outside the post office in June, the careful observation she'd made then about the territory growing, the maybe he'd given her. He'd been thinking about it. She hadn't known that, but she believed it now. The work is there, she said. You're right about that. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and left. She watched the door close behind him and stood at the cutting table for a moment with her shears in her hand. She did not feel vindicated. She had expected to feel vindicated, and she didn't, quite. What she felt was something more tired and more specific than that. The feeling of a chapter closing, which was not triumphant but was final, and finality was its own kind of relief. She went back to cutting. November brought the first real snow of the season, and with it, the 6-month review Henderson had specified in the association contract. She had prepared for it the way she'd prepared for the original meeting, with documentation, with samples, with the specific and unsentimental approach that she'd found worked better with Henderson than any kind of performance would have. She took the wagon to Billings on a Tuesday, alone this time, which was its own statement, and she sat across from Henderson in the same back room of the merchant's building and went through the numbers. She had exceeded the minimum volume by 31%. She had met every delivery timeline. She had received, Henderson said, 3 separate commendations from association members on the quality of the work. This last piece of information he delivered with what she now recognized as his version of pleasure, which was a specific quality of understatement, a slight flattening of the voice that meant the opposite of what it sounded like. "The contract continues," he said. "I'd like to discuss expansion of the custom goods category. There's demand from 2 of the northern settlements that I don't currently have a supplier for." She discussed it. She asked the right questions and took notes and did not commit to anything she hadn't calculated and committed to one thing she had. And when she left the merchant's building an hour later, the contract in her bag was larger than the one she'd arrived with. She sat in the wagon for a few minutes before she started back. It was cold, and the sky was the flat white of incoming snow, and Billings moved around her with the indifferent momentum of a town that was not aware of or particularly interested in what had just happened in the back room of one of its buildings. She thought about the morning Harold Vance walked into her cabin without knocking, about the 11 cents in her coat pocket and the borrowed mule and the saloon doorway, and Maisie's hands wrapped around a bowl of soup she hadn't paid for, about the tin box with Daniel's death certificate and the letter about straight seams and the bank extension agreement and the association contract all folded together now, accumulating. She thought, look how far. She thought it to Daniel, and to her mother who had taught her to sew in a kitchen in Ohio that smelled of bread, and to herself at 29 standing at a grave in October trying to understand how you build a life when the scaffolding has been removed. She thought it the way you think things to people who aren't there, not expecting an answer, not performing grief, just keeping the line open. Then she picked up the reins and started home. The spring came, as springs do, without asking permission. March in Montana was not a gentle thing. It was mud and freeze-thaw and livestock that had been confined all winter and were determinedly difficult about it, and roads that were alternately impassable and merely terrible, and the persistent, groundless optimism of a landscape that had been brown and frozen for months and was now, with great effort and no elegance, becoming something else. Eliza had learned to love March in Montana, which had taken 3 years, and she would not have predicted it about herself. She went to Colton's ranch on a Saturday in the 3rd week of March. Not for business, or not primarily, though she'd brought a completed order because there was no reason to make 2 trips. She'd sent no note ahead. She had discovered over the months that she did not need to send notes ahead for Colton's ranch, that she was expected in some ambient sense that she could not have defined precisely and did not try to. He was in the barn when she arrived, working on something with a harness, and he looked up when she came through the door and said, "There's coffee on," which was not a greeting exactly, but functioned as one. She put the order on the bench and sat on an upturned crate and watched him work for a moment. His movements were the same as they'd always been, economical, purposeful, nothing wasted. She had watched him work many times now, and she still found something clarifying about it, the same way she found something clarifying about the machine, the proof, in repeated physical action, that doing things well was not complicated, only effortful. "Spring?" she said. "Such as it is," he said. "The road from Hargroves was a disaster this morning." "It always is in March. Give it 2 weeks." She looked at her hands in her lap. She had the particular sensation of being on the edge of something, not precipice-shaped and frightening, but threshold-shaped, which was different, a door rather than a cliff. "You said to ask you in the spring," she said. He set the harness down. He looked at her with the direct attention he brought to everything, and she held it. "I'm asking," she said. "What do you want?" He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating. She could tell the difference between him hesitating and him taking what he needed to say seriously, but making sure he said it right. "I want to be in your life," he said. "Not ahead of it, not managing it. In it." He paused. "I think I've been in it for a while already, in most of the ways that matter. I'd like to stop pretending that's a business arrangement." She looked at him. She thought about the supper table with Maisie between them and the letter about his mother in Kansas, and the way he'd said, "You're right," when most men would have argued, and the 4-hour wagon ride in the rain when they'd talked about the things that had shaped them into who they were. She thought about Daniel, who she had loved with the wholehearted certainty of a young woman who had never lost anyone, and who she still loved in the way you love something that is finished, completely, without ambivalence, without expecting it to be other than what it was. That love did not require her to be finished. She had understood this slowly, over the months, in the way you understand things that require you to be ready before they become clear. "I'm not the woman I was when I came here," she said. "I need you to know that. I'm not easy. I'm particular about my work and my decisions, and I will not be managed, not even well-meaningly." "I know that," he said, and then with the slight arid quality that served as his version of humor, "I've been aware of it for some time. I'm telling you because it's not going to change," she said. "I'm not going to become more accommodating because things are better." "I don't want you to." She believed him. She had been believing him for over a year, and it had not yet been wrong. "Then yes," she said. "That's what I want too." He didn't cross the barn dramatically. He didn't need to. He walked over to where she was sitting on the upturned crate and held out his hand, and she took it, and they stood like that for a moment in the barn, with the horses shifting in their stalls and the thin March light coming in through the gaps in the boards. And it was not a beautiful moment in the way stories make moments beautiful. It was cold, and it smelled like horses, and she was wearing her work coat, and her hands were rough from the winter, and neither of them were young. But it was real, which was better than beautiful, and it was chosen, which was better than easy, and she held his hand and thought, yes, this. They married in May, a small ceremony at the county judge's office, with Maisie as a witness. She had insisted on being witness, had in fact drafted an argument for why she should be allowed that Eliza suspected had been influenced by the logic exercises in the primer, and Martha Hargrove and Nora and Clara in attendance, and the celebration afterward at the Hargrove Ranch, which Martha had organized with the same capable, unapologetic efficiency she applied to everything, and which Eliza had stopped trying to redirect once she understood that Martha's way of loving people was to arrange things for them, and that refusing arrangements was refusing love, which she was done doing. She did not change her name. She had discussed this with Colton before the ceremony, plainly and without apology. The business was under Whitmore, had been built under Whitmore, was known under Whitmore throughout the association network, and among the valley ranches and in Billings, and in 2 of the northern settlements, and changing it would cost her something concrete that she was not willing to lose. He had not flinched at this. He had said that made sense and asked what she wanted to do about Maisie's name, and they had discussed it rationally, and Maisie had been consulted, and Maisie had decided she would like to be Maisie Whitmore Reeves because she felt this covered all relevant bases, and that was what they did. Colton moved into the cabin first while they worked out the arrangement of the ranch, which involved more logistical and legal complexity than either of them had anticipated, and occupied 3 months of Saturday mornings at the kitchen table with documents and coffee. He adapted to the cabin's small spaces without complaint, which she noticed without commenting on. He fixed things. The step that had been soft since October, the window that didn't quite shut, the lean-to latch that she'd replaced herself after the break-in, but that he improved on, setting the screws deeper, adding a second bolt. He did these things quietly, without announcing them, and she noticed each one. She fixed things too. The accounts for the ranch were a moderate disaster, kept in the energetic but unmethodical way of a man who was extremely good at running cattle and moderately bad at paperwork. She spent a Sunday in October going through 2 years of records with the focused attention she'd applied to her own business ledger and reorganized them into a system she could explain to him and that he could maintain without her, which was the goal. Not to take it over, but to build something durable. "This is better," he said when she showed him. "It wasn't terrible," she said, "just inconsistent." "It was somewhat terrible," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the ledger with an expression of mild self-reproach that she found, privately, endearing. "We'll call it a work in progress," she said. "That's generous." "I'm frequently generous," she said deadpan, and he looked at her, and the almost smile that she had spent a year waiting to arrive finally made it all the way to his face, and she thought about how long it had taken and didn't mind. The business grew in the way she'd intended it to grow. Not explosively, not because explosion wasn't available, but because she had seen enough operations scale too fast and collapse under their own momentum. She was deliberate. She added one person at a time, trained each one properly, built the client relationships before she expanded the capacity to serve them. By the end of 1888, she had 7 women working in the storefront on the secondary street, and the storefront was too small, and she was in negotiation for the larger space 2 doors down. Nora was running the daily operations. This had happened organically, through Nora's expanding competence and Eliza's expanding demands on her own time, and then explicitly when Eliza sat her down in November and said, "I'm going to give you a formal role and a formal wage to match what you're already doing." Nora received this with the composed equanimity she'd developed over the year and a half they'd worked together, and then asked 2 pointed questions about the scope of her authority, which told Eliza she'd been thinking about it herself. She raised Nora's wage to $1.50 a day, which was more than most men in comparable positions in Harlan's Creek earned, and which she paid without apology because the work warranted it, and because she had spent enough of her own life being underpaid to know what it felt like from the inside. Patterson came by the storefront once more, that winter, on a day when he had work he needed done faster than his own operation could turn it. He stood in the anteroom with his order and the particular expression of a man swallowing something that isn't comfortable. And she quoted him her standard rate, and he paid it, and she did the work on time and correctly, and that was the entirety of their professional relationship going forward, careful, functional, without warmth and without hostility, which was all she had wanted from him and all she expected from it. Maisie turned 8 in the spring of 1889. She was reading properly now, full sentences, with the focused delight of someone who has just discovered that a skill they'd been laboring toward is actually, suddenly, a pleasure. She read everything she could reach, which, at Eliza and Colton's combined household, was considerably more than it had been in the cabin, because Colton had been accumulating books in a quiet, uncommitted way for years, stacked on shelves in the ranch office, not organized, gathered rather than collected, and Maisie descended on them with systematic thoroughness. She and Colton had an ongoing conversation about the books that Eliza watched from the edges, with something that wasn't quite awe, but was adjacent to it. He talked to Maisie the way he had always talked to her, seriously, as though her thoughts were worth engaging with rather than managing. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not ruffle her hair or call her by diminutives or perform affection in the ways that some adults do with children, because it's easier than actual attention. He paid her actual attention, and Maisie, who had grown up with a mother who also paid her actual attention and had therefore high standards in this regard, accepted his without reservation, which told Eliza something she didn't need to be told but was glad to have confirmed. One evening in late April, coming in from the storefront later than she'd meant to, she found them at the kitchen table. Colton had a map spread out, one of the territory maps he used for ranch business, and Maisie was asking him to show her where Iowa was. He was tracing the route west with one finger, explaining the journey his family had taken, and Maisie was following with her finger too, not touching the paper but hovering just above it, learning the shape of the distance. She stood in the doorway and did not announce herself for a moment. She thought about the morning she'd sat at this table and counted coins and arrived at $19.40 short and the specific weight of that arithmetic. She thought about what it cost to not stop. Not the romantic version of not stopping, the one where the not stopping is clearly heroic and the ending is clearly coming and you are the protagonist of a story with a discernible arc. The real version, which is that you don't stop, because stopping means Maisie goes hungry and the machine goes away and everything you've built goes with it, and so you don't stop. And then one day you look up and the thing you were building is built and you are not sure exactly when it happened. She thought, this is what the not stopping looks like. A kitchen table and a map of Iowa, and a man who takes her daughter seriously, and the storefront on the secondary street with 7 women in it, and the association contract renewed twice now, and the tin box in the bedroom where all the significant papers live, accumulating. It doesn't look like empire. That word, she had always found it slightly absurd when applied to her own life. She was a woman who made things out of cloth, who kept books carefully and paid people fairly, and built one reliable relationship at a time, and the word empire implied something she'd never been interested in. What she'd built was something smaller and more durable than empire. It was a life with her own name on it. It was a business that would outlast the conditions that had created it. It was Nora with authority, and Agnes with steadiness, and Clara with her expert eye, and 7 women who showed up in the morning knowing their work had value because she had decided, early and without being certain it would work, that that was the operation she was going to run. It was Maisie's finger hovering over the map of Iowa, learning the distance. She came inside and hung her coat, and Maisie looked up and said, "Mama, did you know Iowa is this far?" indicating with a span of fingers. "I did know that," she said. "Colton walked it, partly. On a horse for the last part." "The horse did the walking," Colton said, without looking up from the map. "You directed the horse," Maisie said, with the precision of someone who finds this distinction important. "That's fair," he said. Eliza sat down at the table and pulled the map toward her and looked at the route his finger had traced and thought about her own route, the train west, the landscape changing through the window, her younger self who had not known yet what Montana would take from her and what it would make of what was left. She did not romanticize that woman, did not imagine her as braver or simpler or more innocent. She had been herself, then as now, particular and capable and more frightened than she showed and more determined than she knew. The determination, it turned out, was not a quality she had chosen. It was a quality she had discovered under pressure, which is where most real qualities reveal themselves. She had not known, sitting on that train, that she would be here. But here was where the road had gone, and she had taken each turning as it came. And the accumulation of turnings was this: a kitchen table, a map, the people she'd chosen, and who had chosen her back, and the quiet, unremarkable fact of a life that belonged to her. There is something nobody tells you about survival. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind in stories where the survival is the point, and everyone can see it coming, and you get credit for it at the end. The ordinary kind. The kind that is mostly getting up in the cold and making breakfast and going to work, and coming home and doing it again, day after day, without the certainty that it is leading anywhere, without the guarantee that the effort will be sufficient. Nobody tells you that this kind of survival does not feel heroic while you are in it. It feels like Tuesday. It feels like a broken latch and $19.40 short, and the arithmetic that keeps coming up the same way no matter how many times you run it. And then one day it feels like this. Like a kitchen in April with people you love in it. Like a business with your name on it. Like 7 women who show up in the morning. Like a daughter who knows she can go anywhere she stands. The machine was still in the corner of the storefront. She had bought a second one and a third, and would buy more as the work required. But the first one, Daniel's machine, the one Vance had looked at with his inventory eyes, the one she had defended with her body in the doorframe of her own home, that one she kept at the original station, the one with the best light from the window. She did not keep it for sentimental reasons. She kept it because it was an excellent machine, and because it worked, and because she had learned over the years that the things that have held up under real pressure are worth keeping. Nora used it now, most days. She was the best of them, technically. She had surpassed Eliza in certain refinements, which Eliza had told her plainly and without ego, because it was true, and because your people being better than you at things is not a threat. It is the whole point. Nora sat at the machine with the same forward-leaning concentration she'd had at 15, and the seams she produced were impeccable, and the clients who came in from the association network often didn't know and didn't need to know that the woman running the station had started at 30 cents a day 3 years ago. Eliza watched her sometimes from the front anteroom where she handled the business side of things, the contracts and the pricing and the client relationships that required her particular quality of attention. She watched Nora work and thought about her mother teaching her in Ohio, and about the women in this territory who did good work and had no one to teach them or pay them fairly or tell them their skills had value, and she thought about what she had built and what it was for. It was for this. Not the abstract version, not the version where it's a symbol of something, the specific version. Nora's hands on the machine, Agnes showing up reliably every morning, Clara's eye catching a flaw that everyone else missed. A girl who grew up watching her mother fight for the right to work and who would never need to wonder whether that right was hers. She was not finished. She was clear-eyed about that. The Northern Settlements contracts were still establishing themselves. The new storefront space was not yet fully operational. The books for the combined household and the business were a system she was still refining. There were problems ahead she couldn't see yet, which was the nature of ahead. She had stopped expecting smooth and learned to expect workable, and workable was enough. On a Wednesday morning in June of that year, she arrived at the storefront before any of the others, unlocked the door, and stood for a moment in the empty room before lighting the lamps. She could hear the town starting up outside. A cart on the road, someone's voice carrying in the early air, the particular sound of a place waking into its own ordinary day. She lit the lamps. She opened the ledger. She looked at the numbers, which were where she'd left them and were moving in the right direction as they had been for more than 2 years now, as she intended them to keep moving. She heard the sound of boots on the step and the bell above the door, and Nora came in with her coat still buttoned and her lunch pail and the expression of someone who is awake and ready. And then Clara behind her, and Agnes, and the others one by one, until the room was full and the machines were running, and the sound of it, needles, thread, cloth moving through mechanisms, women talking to each other in the low, efficient way of people who work well together, filled the space the way warmth fills a room, not all at once, but steadily, until the cold is simply gone. Eliza stood at the cutting table and picked up her shears. Outside, Harlan's Creek went about its business. The town that had not knocked. The town that had written her off with such confidence, such casual thoroughness, the way people write off things they've decided aren't worth the investment of attention. She did not hate it for that now. She had stopped hating it for that somewhere in the long middle of building something inside it, because hate requires energy, and she had better uses for hers, and because the town's opinion of her had stopped being the thing she was working toward or against. She was working toward the ledger, and the women in the room, and the machines running, and the contracts in the tin box, and Maisie's finger tracing the distance on the map. She was working toward a life that had her name on it, and she had it. Not perfectly, not without cost or loss, or the particular fatigue of someone who has been pushing against a headwind for so long that it has become the ground condition, the thing you work inside of, rather than the thing you'll eventually escape. She still had days that were just hard, days when the machine jammed and the accounting didn't balance, and Maisie came home from school with a bruised feeling she couldn't or wouldn't name, and the distance to Daniel felt, briefly, as acute as it had in the first year. Those days still came. She worked through them. That was what she knew how to do, and it was enough, and it always had been. The seam holds if you set it right. That was the thing. That was the only thing. Not luck, not rescue, not the moment when the world decides to be fair to you. Because the world does not decide that. The world simply continues, indifferent and magnificent and entirely uninterested in your story. But if you set the seam right, and you do the work, and you show up in the morning, and you do not let anyone walk into your home and look at the one thing keeping you alive like it already belongs to them, if you hold that line, the seam holds. Eliza Whitmore held that line, and everything else followed from it.